I've been a speedrunner for over a decade at this point, and I still find speedruns endlessly fascinating. I think the act of taking a game and trying to beat it as fast as possible tends to require a ton of creativity and skills, and as such, it's a very deep and multifaceted craft. One thing I love is how much variety there is across different games. Some games are all about raw execution. Some games are big on routing and memorization. Some games test your reflexes and force you to adapt on the fly. And then some games might feel like they shouldn't be speedrunnable at all. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games are a series of games where you go through dungeons made up of multiple floors. Each floor is an exit, and the objective is to find it, move on to the next floor, and repeat until the dungeon is complete. The only problem is, everything is random. Enemy encounters, item spawns, your own starting room, and most importantly, the floor layout itself, including the location of the stairs. And yet, not only are these games very speedrunnable, but among the games I've personally run, I find them to be some of the most interesting ones. And that might sound pretty weird, because usually speedrunning a game relies on being able to get so familiar with it that you can develop muscle memory around it and have a complete mastery over it. But we can't really do that in a game that completely changes from run to run, can we? I love every game in the series, and some of the more recent titles make for particularly complex runs. But today I'd like to focus on the second entry in the series on the Nintendo DS, which is Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky. This is one of my favorite games of all time. I love its environments and its characters, and its story about friendship and selflessness, which was highly impactful for me growing up. It was even the first game to ever make me cry tears of sadness during a scene I'm sure everybody who's played this game can take a guess at. But nevertheless, the question still remains, how can you even speedrun a game where the bulk of the gameplay is completely random? In this video, I want to explore how this is managed, and why, perhaps surprisingly, it still makes for a great run where mastery really matters. First of all, just for a bit of context, normally this is a very long run. We are going to be covering the any % no WM category, which aims to beat the game as fast as possible without making use of the Wonder Meal system, which would basically allow us to get very powerful items early on. This run is over 5 hours long, owing to a lot of long and skippable cutscenes. This is honestly surprisingly cozy due to the fact that we can just hold B to automatically advance dialogue and even use something like a clothespin to hold it down for us and allowing us to get up, stretch, use the bathroom, or go grab something to eat when necessary. But alternatively, this game can also be run on a speedrun mod, which removes all unskippable cutscenes and brings the time down to potentially under 2 hours. There are leaderboards for both, and it's valid to run whichever one prefers. Alright, onto the run itself. After a brief intro, we're thrown into the first dungeon of the run, which is Beach Cave. We can move around using the D-pad, and dash by holding B and other action, which will make us run until we hit a wall or some other entity we can interact with. We are given a helpful minimap displaying the parts of the floor we've already explored. Our objective, once again, is to move around until we find the room that contains the stairs leading to the next floor. Every dungeon is made up of a different amount of floors, and when we've cleared every floor, we will have successfully completed the dungeon. As we go through each floor, we will also find various items on the floor and encounter enemies. The items we can find will change from floor to floor and from dungeon to dungeon. These can be very useful, and we will be able to keep them after we're out of the dungeon, so throughout the entire run, we will have to manage our inventory and look out for a bunch of specific items that will help us out a ton. As far as the enemies are concerned, sometimes we can ignore them and attempt to outrun them as we dash for the stairs. If we choose to fight them instead, we have a few options available. We can use a basic attack by pressing A, though this is fairly weak. We can use or throw an item, like a Blast Seed, which deals a decent amount of damage to early game enemies, or a Sleep Seed, which can put an enemy to sleep. Finally, we can use our moves. These are much more powerful, but they have power points, which will go down by 1 each time a move gets used, and when they reach 0, we won't be able to use that move anymore until the end of the dungeon. While these power points, which from now on I will shorten to PPs, are usually plenty for the early game dungeons, later on in the run we will have to be much more careful to make sure we have them available when necessary, as we'll expand on later. The presence of these enemies also affects the way we want to move around. In a vacuum, constant dashing is the fastest movement option. However, moving through unnecessary tiles can cause more enemies to spawn over the long run, so it's often a good idea to throw in some slower walks in order to make more accurate movement. With all that being said, since we're speedrunning this game, our goal is generally to find the stairs as fast as possible. So, what should our approach be? It would seem like we just have to try every path until we get lucky and find the right one. That would be pretty rough. But let's take a step back. Before we get into any of the gameplay, the game starts with a fairly important decision. Which Pokémon team do we use? The speedrun mod allows us to freely choose our protagonist, but on the original game, we are assigned our protagonist based on the responses to a personality quiz, and then left to freely choose our partner after that. We can't choose 2 Pokémon with a matching type, so we can't have 2 other types, for example, but other than that, we have a fairly wide array of Pokémon to choose from, which you can now see on screen. Well, surprisingly there are many viable choices here. Over this game's history, the world record has been set using all kinds of Pokemon such as Kitty, Vulpix, Totodile, and Bulbasaur. And it's not like it doesn't really matter. Each Pokemon has their own strengths and weaknesses, and it just so happens that they end up being relatively balanced with each other. But with that being said, right now the team that is believed to likely be fastest consists of Eevee as the protagonist and Totodile as the partner. Eevee is a bit of a glass cannon, allowing us to hit hard thanks to her adaptability ability, boosting normal type moves and also meeting very few type resistances, while at the same time being pretty frail and requiring us to be somewhat careful. Totodile on the other hand is fairly bulky, while at the same time being able to hit decently hard in return. Funnily enough, we've already gotten our first piece of randomness here, because the personality quiz itself uses randomly generated questions, and adult questions allow us to answer in such a way that it leads to getting the protagonist we want. The solution comes in the form of an RNG manipulation. I covered this in more detail in a previous video that you can go watch if you're interested in knowing more, but in short, by holding a button at all times during the game's boot up sequence and buffering our inputs into the quiz, we can guarantee that we get the same questions every time, and thus we can get our Eevee or whatever other Pokemon we might want. This, however, is an exception and not the norm. Shortly thereafter, we will get thrown into the first dungeon, which is Beach Cave, and from here on out, almost the entire rest of the game is completely impossible to manipulate, and so we will have to deal with our random floors and do our best to navigate through them. So, once again, how do we approach this? Well, there is one important thing we will realize pretty quickly after going through a few dungeons. It would seem that every floor ultimately has a pretty grid-like structure. What's going on here? In fact, while this isn't true of every floor, most of them are generated using a very interesting algorithm, and it is going to be very helpful to understand a little bit about how it works. My explanations throughout this video will be very simplified, and if you're interested in more details, I highly recommend watching the Zaz Glitches video on this topic, which goes into greater depth. But with that being said, first of all, most floors are actually just a very simple grid divided into multiple rectangular sectors. The size of this grid is a little random and will vary from floor to floor and from dungeon to dungeon, but here in Beach Cave, every floor is going to be either a 2x2 or a 2x3 grid. Each sector has a chance to contain either 1 room or 0 rooms, meaning that not every sector in this grid is guaranteed to contain a room. Finally, once the locations of these rooms have been decided, the game will draw hallways connecting these rooms with each other. With that in mind, our objective is to explore rooms in order and minimize backtracking. So if we spawn in a central room, like in this image, we do not want to go across and then up, as if we don't find the stairs within these rooms, we would then be forced to head back down and traverse a room we have already explored, which is a waste of time. Instead, we can avoid this by traveling in a clockwise or anti-clockwise motion. This isn't something we can always perfectly follow, because sometimes there just won't be any hallways connecting to where we want to go. But the objective is still to generally minimize backtracking as much as possible. What's more about this grid formation is, the minimap displaying the floor layout will always be aligned with the left side of the screen, which actually provides us with some really useful information. Let's take this kind of spawn location for example. There are 2 hallways leading out of this room, one on the left side and one on the right. Since according to the minimap, this room is located in the second sector from the left, and we know that in Beach Cave there are only 2 sectors horizontally, we know that there can't possibly be any more rooms to the right, and we can exclude that hallway right away. This kind of knowledge about floor generation allows us to make more informed decisions about our play and increase our likelihood of finding the stairs quickly. There's a little more we'll go over that can help us make even better choices, but for now, this will suffice. Once we beat the 4 floors that make up Beach Cave, we got our first boss fight against Coughing and Zubat. This one is really simple. We tap A and B to skip our turn and let them approach. This will also get our partner Totodile next to us and ready for action. After that, we simply take them out with a few attacks. Dying here is almost impossible. We will play another short dungeon after that, Drench Bluff, in which we will want to be on the lookout for some useful items. Blast Seeds, Sleep Seeds, Stun Seeds, don't read that backwards, and Geopebbles, which are damage and status items for upcoming boss fights, Oran Berries to replenish our health in case of danger, Max Elixirs to replenish the PPs of our moves, and other miscellaneous and situational items that could save us from sticky spots. Now, many of these items share their sprite with items that we won't actually want. For example, there are many types of seeds that we don't have a use for, and since our inventory space is limited, we will want to avoid picking up junk. The way we work around this is by dashing on top of ambiguous items instead of walking onto them. This will prevent us from picking them up, and instead display their name at the bottom of the screen. If it's an item we want to collect, we can quickly walk off and on the item again to pick it up, otherwise we're free to move on. Even better, to pick that item up, we can let our partner do it, by moving in such a way that they'll end up on top of it. This is a little faster in and of itself, but it also avoids triggering tutorial text if it's the first time we pick up an item of that kind. Anyway, once we're out of this dungeon, we will briefly get the opportunity to visit town, where we can check the shop for some useful items. There's 2 shops here managed by the Caclium brothers, one selling general items and the other one selling orbs. If we want to be safer, we can check the general store and buy a reviver seed if it sells it. This item can also rarely appear in dungeons, and it's extremely powerful. Upon dying in this game, we get punished quite heavily as we instantly lose the dungeon and have to retry it from the beginning. And as if that wasn't enough, we also randomly lose half our item inventory and half our money. We really want to avoid this outcome. And reviver seeds are a blessing. What they do is, when we die, they immediately revive us with full health and PPs. Having a few of these on hand not only makes the run much safer, but it also allows us to have a more reckless playstyle, favoring risk-taking behavior and relative safety, and ultimately allowing us to save some time by, for example, avoiding having to heal when at low health, or attempting to attack enemies in situations where missing them would otherwise lead to disaster. Back to the shops though, by contrast, checking the orbs shop instead of the general store offers a more aggressive play. These items are basically one-time use moves that can have pretty interesting effects. If we get lucky enough, we can get some crowd control orbs, such as a foothold orb, which can petrify every enemy in the floor and render them unable to move. An escape orb here is also great, which will immediately exit out of a dungeon and will be useful later in the run. After that, our next dungeon is Mont Bristle, and this is a big difficulty spike. The enemies here are really tough, as they will both hit hard and usually take at least 2 hits to kill. It is honestly a very dangerous part of the game, and the most frequent spot where runs die. During the course of the run, encountering enemies is a statistical inevitability, so knowing how to fight them effectively is not only going to help us go faster, but also stay safer. Whenever we can just kill them in one hit, we obviously can't just do that and move on, but what if the enemy we're fighting is bulkier than that? In that case, our partner can come in very handy. By making sure that we're fighting said enemies side by side with our partner, we can attack them with the entire team's moves and potentially kill them an entire turn sooner. This is huge if it allows us to skip having to take an enemy hit, which will save us the damage that would deal, but it will also save us time from simply not having to watch that attack animation. Whenever our partner would help us out in combat, we want to do pretty much anything we can to get them involved. Waiting, taking a step back, or even doing other weird movements is all often worth it if it means getting more efficient combat out of it. There's also another important optimization involved in combat, however, and this one is fairly subtle. After most attacks, for whatever reason, the game will briefly pause. And for whatever reason, we can skip this pause by either holding A and B or tapping the D-pad in any direction. So, by doing one of these two things during combat, we can speed up animations by a pretty significant amount. This technique is creatively called pause skipping, and it's a little dangerous to perform because holding A and B or tapping the D-pad when the current combat turn is over will result in either skipping the next turn or moving respectively, as that's just what these hotkeys normally do. So when doing pause skips, we need to be pretty careful to not accidentally do any of these things. The way we can perform this technique in relative safety is by holding A and B when we're performing our move, and switching to mashing the D-pad directly towards an enemy if we're right up against them. The time saved from performing a pause skip on its own isn't huge, but doing this on every single enemy encounter will build up to several minutes of time save over the course of a run this long. Once we're out of Mont Bristle, we're going to face off against Drowzee, our second boss. This fight is insanely dangerous, as he has a decent amount of HP, hits quite hard, can put us to sleep by using hypnosis, and as if that wasn't enough, he has the Forlorn ability, which will give him a 1 in 5 chance to dodge moves that would otherwise hit him. If we have a blast seed, we want to use it here, as it deals a third of his health worth of damage and is guaranteed to hit since it bypasses Forlorn. For a fast fight, we just have to try and hit him with our moves and hope they hit, which may very well not go in our favor. Our reviver seed here is extremely helpful to have as a safety net. However, if wanting complete safety, there is a pretty good option in the form of RNG manip. Recall that a while ago I said the following: from here on out, almost the entire rest of the game is completely impossible to manipulate. This is the reason I had to add an almost in that sentence. This game uses multiple RNG values to control different aspects of randomness. There's a global RNG value, which controls the personality quiz we went through at the start, overworld events like the items that the Kaklan shop is going to sell, and other things. But upon entering a dungeon, another set of RNG values is going to get seeded from the global RNG, which we will call dungeon RNGs. We'll simplify a bit, but within these dungeon RNGs, there's a pre-seed value, which directly controls the layouts generated, and there's a working value, which controls dungeon events, such as whether moves will hit or miss, how much damage they deal, and which moves enemies will choose to use. This might sound like a pure technicality, but the reason this is relevant is because of the game's quick save feature. This is an option that can be accessed from the in-game menu. It is meant as a temporary save, allowing one to resume their playthrough at any time, but only once, as the quick save will get deleted after resuming. And there is a flaw with how this feature was programmed. You see, when making a quick save, the game correctly stores the value of the global RNG, so that when resuming the playthrough, the aspects controlled by that RNG value will continue to be unpredictably random. But when it comes to dungeon RNGs, it will save the preseed that controls dungeon layouts, but not the working value, instead opting to reinitialize it to a fixed known value, which will then make the next events predictable. This isn't particularly useful in the middle of a dungeon, but it can be useful to manipulate boss fights. For Drowzee, we can immediately quick save, go back into the game, and then follow this sequence of inputs. Dash down right, tap A and B to skip a turn, use tackle, tap A and B to skip Eevee's next turn, and use tackle again, which will finish the fight. This manipulates a very good battle, making our moves never miss and never getting any particularly nasty attacks from Drowzee, but overall the manipulation is still a few seconds slower than an average non-manipulated fight. This is due to the time it takes to quick save and get back into the game. However, it is still usually worth doing this manipulation. In a long and highly random run like this one, being able to more consistently continue runs is much more valuable than potentially being able to save a small amount of time but have to reset more often. Once we beat Drowzee, we will be introduced to one of the game's core mechanics, which is jobs. These are missions that are asked of us by various clients, such as finding an item or rescuing a Pokémon, and require us to travel to specific floors of specific dungeons to complete. At this point of the game, the story won't progress until we clear 3 jobs, but what's notable is that we can perform all of these within the same dungeon and within the same trip to the dungeon. We can get them over at the mission board or in a bottle over by the beach just outside of town, and unfortunately which missions we get and where are random. Sometimes we're going to be able to complete 3 fast ones in Peach Cave, sometimes we're going to have to head out into the longer Drench Bluff, and sometimes we just won't be able to do them all in one trip and are going to have to lose time by splitting it up in multiple ones. After that, we will go through a quick sentry duty minigame where we have to recognize Pokémon footprints. We want to get 3 answers wrong on purpose, as this will lower our score just enough to give us a shorter dialogue sequence right after, since we will be told we just did adequate instead of being praised for our excellent performance. After we clear 2 more jobs, we will go through one more dungeon, which is Waterfall Cave. This place is thankfully easier than Mumbraceau, but the enemies still tend to be pretty bulky, so having Totodile around to help kill them is still very helpful. Here, we also want to start checking these pink scarves that started appearing just now. These are equipable items that can give us different buffs. What we're really interested in finding are a power band and a special band, which will boost our physical and special attack respectively. Eevee only has physical moves, so we only want a power band for her, but Totodile can use both bands as he has both physical and special attacks. After we beat Waterfall Cave, we will have to complete one mission, then play Sentry Duty again. This time we want to actually answer every question correctly, as doing so will reward us with a Reviver Seed now, which is well worth the 15 seconds the longer dialogue loses. And after one filler day, where we just have to enter a dungeon and either beat it or leave it early by using an escape orb if we have it, we will have to play Applewoods, which is our longest dungeon yet. However, what's notable here is that on this day, the Electivire Link Shop will open in town, which allows us to start linking our moves. Link moves are extremely powerful. When 2 or more moves are linked, they will be used in sequence one after another within the same turn, which is an insane boost to our damage. As if that wasn't enough, we will also gain more experience when killing enemies after having used linked moves, so we will get stronger and bulkier by the end of the run thanks to them. There are a few downsides to linking moves, however. First of all, PPs will be consumed for both moves. Secondly, our belly decreases slightly upon use. I haven't explained what this is, but it's basically a stat that starts at 100 and gradually goes down as we move around, and when it hits 0 we will start to starve, losing the ability to dash and gradually taking damage. We don't run the risk of starvation in many dungeons, however, and we can just replenish our belly by eating a food item like an apple or by getting revived by a Reviver Seed. The last and most important downside about linked moves for us speedrunners, however, is that after killing an enemy with a move that's part of the link set, the rest of the moves of that link set will continue to be used. Watching these move animations is just wasted time for us, so while we want to link moves in such a way that allows us to kill as many enemies as possible in one turn, we don't want to overdo it and link more attacking moves that we need. If we already have a power band, we don't actually want to link any moves on Eevee, as her tackle attack is already powerful enough to kill every enemy coming up in one hit. If we don't have it, then we want to link it with Flail, which is another powerful move that we'll talk more about later. For Totodile on the other hand, we will always want to link Water Gun and Scratch together. About Applewoods itself, this dungeon has a few dangerous enemies, including Butterfree and Executor, who can put us to sleep with Sleep Powder and Hypnosis respectively. A few floors in this place are notable for being more consistent than the rest, and they are 7F and 8F. 7F always has a series of hallways forming a ring on the outside and 8 rooms forming a grid in the middle of the map, though occasionally some of these rooms might be merged into one. 8F on the other hand is the opposite of that, having a series of hallways meeting down the middle of the map and 10 rooms forming a ring on the outside. The layouts around this part of the run are starting to get pretty big and complex. Navigating our way to the stairs has gotten quite time consuming at times. It's particularly bad when we run into dead ends, which leaves us with no other choice but to waste our time backtracking. Is there really nothing we can do to help get around floors? Well, there is. Let's take a look at the floor generation process again. As we established earlier, the game will first create a grid of sectors with a size that will vary from floor to floor. Then each sector will randomly contain either 0 or 1 rooms. Finally, each room is connected with each other by hallways. But here's what we haven't mentioned yet. Before presenting a floor to the player, the game will add a few finishing touches to the floor, such as lakes and other special features. But most notably, it will add extra hallways leading out of rooms in order to make layouts a little more complex. These are known by another very creative name, which is extra hallways. What's really notable about them is that, unlike the so-called main hallways that the game generated earlier on, the extra hallways aren't guaranteed to lead anywhere and might just be a dead end. So if we can teleport an extra hallway from a main hallway, we usually want to follow the ladder since it simply presents a higher chance of bringing us anywhere useful. How do we recognize them? Well, there's an interesting difference between main hallways and extra hallways, and it's that main hallways cannot ever start from a corner of a room, while extra hallways can. So if we ever have a choice between a hallway starting from a corner and one starting from anywhere else, we usually want to take the latter. Take a look at this room, for example, and let's assume this is Applewood's 2F. It would appear to be pretty open-ended. But because 2F never generates a grid wider than 3 sectors horizontally, that means we're on the right side of what appears to be a 3x3 grid, excluding the possibility of a room existing on the right. And because the hallway at the top starts from a corner, our best bet is actually to take the hallway on the left, as that is the only hallway that is guaranteed to lead to another room. This is not to say that taking extra hallways is never a good idea, as it does have a chance to lead into a room, and if it can avoid having to backtrack, it can be useful to take one. The play we want to make is very situational and heavily depends on what the floor we're on looks like and which rooms we've already explored. There are many more details about layout generation and the way we can use that knowledge to make better decisions, and I can't possibly list them all, but hopefully that paints a good picture of the things that go into it. Considerations like these are indeed very helpful, though overall, the way we have to play these floors is largely very reactive. We have no way to control the randomness we are subjected to, so the only thing we can do is look at what challenge the game is laying down on us and do the best we can to go through these floors effectively. With this in mind, you might be asking yourself a pretty legitimate question. Doesn't this make for a pretty bad speedrun? We can make all these plays and implement all these optimizations, but if the outcome of how fast we can go is still ultimately subject to how lucky we end up getting, does any of it matter? Isn't running this game just an RNG grind? And the answer is, surprisingly, absolutely not. The reason why is because, while it is true that there is a lot of randomness in this game which highly influences the times we end up getting, as we've had the opportunity to explore a little already, it is also a game that's heavy on the skill element, and there's a really interesting phenomenon that happens when you have a combination of the two. But we'll elaborate more on this in a bit. Once we're out of Applewoods, we'll be having to complete 2 more jobs with a sentry duty in between. This will be our last chance to be in town for a while, because soon after we will embark on the Expedition section, where we will be out on a little adventure and we will play several dungeons back to back. For the first couple dungeons, Craggy Coast and Mount Horn, we will have our first allied non-team member with us, Bidoof. We won't be able to control any of his AI, so he will just kinda do whatever he wants, which is usually using his weak status moves instead of attacking with Headbutt. We will have to babysit him. Also notable is the fact that starting from now, we will be able to put Totodile on the wait there tactic, which will instruct him to not move and just defend against enemies when they approach. This is really good, because at this stage in the run, we don't really need his help to kill almost any enemy in one turn, and it allows him to clear enemies off screen instead, where combat won't play any animations if the Far Off Pal setting is turned off in the in-game options. This will reduce the amount of enemies we will encounter, and once we won't have Bidoof with us anymore, we will also be able to outrun enemies more easily when we're running around on our own. As far as the dungeons themselves go, Craggy Coast presents big layouts, which can take some time to navigate sometimes, while Mount Horn is remarkable for only containing small layouts, the same kind that we've encountered in Beach Cave. However, the enemies here in Mount Horn pose a much bigger threat. A few of them know the move Bite, which on top of dealing damage also lets the enemy eat one of the edible items from our bag at random. This can include max elixirs, oran berries, or even reviver seeds, so that's pretty annoying. However, the most dangerous enemy here is Venomoth, and that's because it knows the move Silverwind. This is a move that can be used from a distance, and will hit everyone within the same room. And as if that wasn't enough, it also has a 20% chance to boost each of the user's stats, meaning attack, defense, special defense, and speed, the last of which being particularly powerful as it allows Venomoth to attack again within the same turn. And this is something that can activate for every opponent the move hits, so if our entire team of 3 all gets hit by this move, that means that the combined odds of Venomoth getting these stat boosts at least once are 48.8%. Absolutely disgusting. And because the layouts in Mount Horn are so small and the game still spawns enemies at the same rate, that means that we're actually more likely to encounter enemies close together, or even spawn in a room with a whole bunch of them. So we need to be ready to deal with the danger they might pose. There's another interesting property about these two dungeons, however, and it's that secret bazaars will begin to spawn. They usually have a 25% chance to spawn on each floor, but they are pretty difficult to find because they are accessed by hidden stairs, which can be revealed by stepping on them. We can also sometimes feel their presence if we get a dash through a room interrupted for seemingly no reason. This usually indicates that there's some hidden stairs nearby. The bazaar contains a few amenities, most notable of which for us being the swallowed grab bag, which, by paying a small amount of money, allows us to get an item selected at random. This wouldn't be particularly interesting if it wasn't for the fact that the item we receive is dependent on the dungeon RNG, which, if you remember from when I first explained this concept in one bristle, we can manipulate with a quick save. By quick saving and then performing specific rituals before talking to Swallow, we can manipulate the items we receive. Different dungeons will give the bazaar a different pool of available items, but this can always be used to get plenty of reviver seeds, as well as other miscellaneous items if necessary, like power bands and crowd control orbs. In certain dungeons, we will also be able to manipulate a warp scarf, which we'll go into more detail about later. Anyway, after Mundhorn, there's not too much to say about the next few dungeons. Bidoof won't be following us anymore, and we will play Foggy Forest, which is a dungeon characterized by long hallways and low rune density. And after that comes Steam Cave, which is a dungeon with an unusually high amount of extra hallways, making movement from one room to the next a bit like trying to traverse a bunch of spaghetti. It is also the first two-part dungeon of the game, where we get a break in the middle allowing us to save our game. And that's because, coming up, we have a major boss fight, Groudon. We will want to dash left to reunite with Totodile and let Groudon approach. From here, there are a few ways to go about this. The standard way is to let Totodile use Leer to lower Groudon's defense while hitting it ourselves with our moves. If we have them, we can also throw a Sleep Seed or two to prevent Groudon's attacks during this period. If we also have a Stun Seed, however, we can do something slightly better. First, we can immediately throw it to petrify Groudon. Now Totodile's AI will stop itself from attacking Groudon until it gets unpetrified, so we can use this opportunity to walk off screen. From here, we can use a few helping hands to considerably boost Totodile's attack, then throw a Sleep Seed from a distance to put Groudon to sleep and unpetrifying it in the process, allowing Totodile to start dishing out his attacks. The strategy is a little more dangerous as it risks having Groudon wake up early and kill Totodile if we aren't ready to counter that by throwing a second Sleep Seed, but if successful, it's a few seconds faster than fighting it on screen. There's definitely different ways that randomness can affect different speedruns. Sometimes randomness can be unhealthy for a run. For example, if a game is big on execution but then just has a handful massively important elements of luck, then what this creates is a run where we can realistically get a well-executed run while also getting all the important luck to line up. Once that run happens, excluding routing improvements, all future attempts at beating such a run will no longer be able to get away with just good play, but will also require getting all the important luck to be favorable. When that luck is unfavorable, this creates the feeling of getting denied a good time when we, so to say, would have deserved it. But there's something pretty remarkable that happens when there's a lot more luck that goes into a run, and it's that it tends to average out. When a run consists of a few hours of constantly being subject to luck, then it is totally possible to get exceedingly lucky for small segments of that run, but when that happens, we will almost certainly have that great luck counterbalanced by some bad luck somewhere else. If you don't believe me yet, here's an analogy. Imagine that your objective is to roll a die and to try to get the highest number you possibly can. If we were to visualize the odds of that, it would look like this. Each number would have the same odds of occurring at a 1 in 6. So if we want to get a great personal best, we absolutely need to roll a 6, which only has a 1/6 of a chance of occurring, but it's something we can realistically get after enough attempts. Now imagine that we're rolling 2 dice and are still trying to get the highest possible number we can. The distribution of odds now looks like this. Suddenly, the numbers near the middle are a lot more likely than anything around the edges. That is because, for example, to roll a 12, we can only achieve it by rolling exactly the following numbers. A 6 followed by a 6. So we need to get the luckiest we can possibly get. However, to get the perfectly average result of a 7, we can get that in many ways. A 1 followed by a 6, a 2 followed by a 5, a 3 followed by a 4, a 4 followed by a 3, a 5 followed by a 2, and a 6 followed by a 1. This is already pretty interesting, but in this situation, getting a 12 is still realistic enough. It is a 1 in 36 chance, which is somewhat rare, but something we will get if we roll the dice enough times. Let's try to roll 1000 dice. Now our odds distribution looks like this. It's even more heavily concentrated down the middle, and the odds of getting any results that are extremely different from the average are pretty much non-existent. In other words, if our objective is to get the highest number we can with our dice, we will basically not have any chance to get the maximum amount possible, which is 6000. We would have to roll a 6 1000 times in a row. That's never gonna happen. In fact, we won't even be able to get anywhere close to it. Instead, we are much more likely to get results that are within somewhere around 3300 and 3700, and anything too far outside this range will be pretty much statistically impossible. If this sounds familiar to anyone with a statistical background, these are basically the facts of the central limit theorem and the law of large numbers. I'm simplifying a lot, but basically it's the idea that if we repeat a random process many times and look at the combined results, the outcomes concentrate much more heavily around the average rather than the extremes. Still, if all we're doing is rolling our dice, across different attempts we will still get different total numbers, and the way we get a higher number on a future attempt is by simply getting luckier. To draw a parallel to speedruns, if a game revolves entirely around luck and demands pretty much no execution from the player, then the way we get a faster time is by simply trying the run again and hoping we get luckier. Where things get interesting is if our speedrun also involves a very significant skill component. Let's go back to our dice analogy, and let's now say that before rolling each die, we can perform a skillful action that, if successful, gives us 1 bonus point on top of the number we get. So the numbers we would get from the die would now be between 2 and 7 instead of 1 and 6. If we're only rolling 2 dice, our graph now looks like this. The overall distribution still has the same shape, it has just shifted to the right a bit. Our new highest possible number we can get is now 14 instead of 12, so if we want to get that number, we absolutely need to be skilled enough to get the bonus point on both dice rolls while also getting the best luck we can possibly get. But because the shift we've gotten isn't very significant, it means that a less skilled dice roller who gets good enough luck to get a 10 for example, will beat a more skilled dice roller who can get the 2 bonus points, gets perfectly average luck and gets a 9. But if we're back to rolling 1000 dice, then the difference is much more decisive. The realistic range of results we can get now if we get our bonus point on every roll is roughly between 4300 and 4700, which is significantly better than what we could get before, which was roughly between 3300 and 3700. Anyone with the skills to get those bonus points will confidently beat anyone who's not able to do that every single time. So it turns out that the most luck-based games here are the ones with only a few random events and not much of an opportunity for skills to be added in. And a long speedrun with a lot of randomness essentially is a game with a lot more dice rolls than a short one with less randomness. So assuming both have a similar skill component, the skill to luck ratio skews more heavily in favor of skill in a longer run compared to a shorter one. This is why Explorers of Sky, and other Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games for that matter, work so well as a speedrun. There is a lot of skill that the game demands from the player. And yes, there is also a lot of randomness involved. But precisely because the randomness is very high, the run is very long, and crucially it comes with a skill component attached, the skill factor ends up overshadowing the luck factor. And so our ability to navigate through floors more efficiently, minimizing backtracking, choosing the paths that are more likely to lead to the stairs, and engaging in enemy combat more effectively really end up shining through. This is not to say that luck does not matter. Far from it, the impact on the time we get is absolutely real. But the point here is that, somewhat surprisingly, this is a game that rewards skill much more than it rewards luck. The Groudon fight marks the end of the expedition section. Once that concludes, we will go back to town, where we just have to let a couple in-game days pass by once again entering a dungeon and then either beating it or using an escape orb to leave early if we have it available. After that, we will go through a short 2-part dungeon in M-Plains. This dungeon is notable for being the first place in which pure seeds spawn, which are items that when eaten will immediately warp us near the stairs. On average, these will save 1 or a few dozen seconds upon use, so we definitely will want to seek them out and pick them up whenever we see them. Another thing to note is that from now on, monster houses will be able to appear. These are rooms that tend to spawn a bunch of items, but when stepped into, will spawn a swarm of enemies. Fighting through one is sometimes possible by retreating into a hallway and killing enemies one by one, but it's very risky and time consuming, so this is a move of last resort. A better option is to keep some crowd control orbs on hand, such as Petrify or Foothold orbs, and immediately use them to put enemies out of play on the spot. At the end of this dungeon, we will fight the Manectric gang. Hopefully we have a stun seed for this fight. Our strategy is going to be to dash left and throw it towards the Manectric, which is the biggest threat. Once that's done, we can target the Electrics one by one, which will all usually die in one turn. After they're gone, we can double team on the Manectric, which will die fairly quickly. After this boss fight, we will be dropped off in town, where we will want to visit the Electivire link shop again to adjust our link sets. We will want to link Tackle with Flail on Eevee if we hadn't done that already, and we will want to link Water Gun, Scratch, and Bite on Totodile so that we will have 3 attacking moves on him to help defend against enemies more effectively, since they're going to start becoming stronger at this point of the game. The next 3 dungeons are Northern Desert, Quicksand Cave, and Quicksand Pit. These places suck. There's a lot of enemies with multi-hit moves, which are characterized by really low accuracy but that will attempt to hit 2 to 5 times per turn and otherwise have roughly the same power of a normal move. Over the course of these dungeons, there's a high risk of eventually getting hit 3 or 4 times by one of these moves, and just getting one shot as a result. So we need to tread carefully against these enemies. That's not the worst thing about these dungeons, however. That would be Sandveil. Sandveil is an ability that some enemies in these dungeons have, those being Sandshrew, Sandslash, Cacnea, and Cacturne. What it does is severely boost their evasions to moves during sandstorm weather, making them more likely to miss. This weather condition is really common here, making it something we often have to contend with. The big problem with this ability is that it's actually an even bigger boost than was probably intended by this game's developers. For some reason, the accuracy of moves is codified under two separate accuracy values, which are both then basically combined together into one. What's notable about Sandveil is that it effectively reduces both of these accuracy values, making it quite a lot stronger. For example, trying to hit EV's tackle on an enemy normally has the two accuracy values of 100 and 95. Now, the actual accuracy of this move is even more complicated than that because, I haven't mentioned this yet, but gender in this game affects stats in a tiny way, with female Pokemon getting a small accuracy boost and male Pokemon getting a small evasion nerf. So the actual accuracy of this move will change depending on who we are and who we're trying to hit. Let's assume we're trying to hit a female Sandslash with our female EV tackle. Her accuracy values get increased a little courtesy of her being a female and go up to 99% overall. Under clear weather conditions, this is the actual accuracy of this move, making it fairly reliable. However, under Sandstorm, Sandslash's Sandveil ends up reducing the accuracy of both values by about 30% each, making our new combined accuracy about 50%. Yikes. Let's just be cautious around these enemies as well, and let's not rely on our moves hitting too much. After these dungeons, and after a surprisingly easy boss fight against Mesprit, who has no health whatsoever and goes down after just a few attacks, we will play Crystal Cave and Crystal Crossing, which can exhibit some tricky layouts, but don't present anything too out of the ordinary otherwise. Finally, at the end of these dungeons, we have the hardest boss fight in the entire run. This fight is the bane of every speedrunner of this game. This fight is by far the most important moment of the entire run. This is Grovyle. The fight opens up by opening the menu and selecting Give Up, and that's it. Yeah, so this fight is supposed to be a scripted loss, where the story will proceed regardless of whether we win or lose, so we might as well lose. We won't lose any items or money either, so there's absolutely no advantage to us winning the fight. This makes this fight trivial. I was joking earlier. After all of that, we advance a couple in-game days with the use of escape orbs if we have them. We won't be able to return to town for a good while after this point, so we need to make sure that all our linked moves are in order if anything happened to them. And if we're low on certain items, we might want to consider visiting the shop in town to resupply on those. The next day, a portal to the future opens, and we unexpectedly end up getting dragged into it against our will and time travel. This begins the future section of the run. There is an objection one could make in regards to the analysis on skill versus luck from earlier. It would be the following. Once we've learned all the ins and outs of a game and we've basically mastered it, wouldn't we then be subjected to a luck grind all over again? Wouldn't our skills start to not matter anymore when trying to beat our personal best time? This is partially true. If our skills stagnate, then the only option we have available to get a better time is to simply run through the game with the same skills and try to get luckier. However, it has to be said that in Explorers of Sky, it's not easy at all to reach the point where our skills remain static. There is an astronomically high amount of room for a runner to improve their skills. In other words, this run doesn't just have a skill ceiling. That ceiling doesn't really exist. It has a skill sky. Remember all the optimizations we've talked about so far? Navigating and moving efficiently, making informed decisions about which paths to take, and fighting enemies effectively. We have made the point that all of these things really matter, and it's very important to make accurate plays around all of these aspects. Now, I need to draw your attention towards something important. Notice how we can input all of our movements within frames. Watch a quick test of a few floors, which is a type of playthrough achieved with frame advance and save states with the objective to demonstrate what perfection looks like. This should make the situation very clear. As humans, we can't even come close to playing perfectly like a task can, but we can certainly make small, gradual improvements in our play. Any faster reactions, any movement performed more optimally will have an enormous impact when repeated across the course of the run. If we save even a single frame over an action repeated thousands of times, it could translate to a full minute of time save alone. And I don't think any runner of this game has come close to maxing out what a human could be capable of. The feature section of the run starts out with Chasm Cave, which is a very interesting place. Floors 1, 4, and 7 will always consist of 5 rooms linked together in a straight line. Every other floor is a crossroads layout, which we encountered in Applewood's 8F already. It's 10 rooms positions on the outside, with hallways meeting down in the middle. These floors are particularly difficult and time-consuming to traverse, so if we have luminous orbs, we want to use them all here. Oh, we haven't really talked about luminous orbs yet, have we? We might have found them along the way while checking for other useful orbs. What they do is immediately reveal the entire minimap, along with the location of every enemy and, most importantly, the stairs. They're not as powerful as a pure seed, which immediately teleports us near the stairs, but they still drastically shorten the average duration of a floor. There's also another pretty good option we have available here if we were able to manipulate a warp scarf from a secret bazaar earlier in the run, and that is to use warp scarf. This is an item that, when equipped, after a few turns will randomly warp us to a random room in the floor. By holding A and B, we can just let the game warp us to different rooms until we end up in the room with the stairs. This is great in this dungeon's crossroads layouts, because enemies tend to concentrate in the hallways in the middle and rarely linger in rooms, so we can usually skip a ton of fights this way. The strategy isn't usually as good in normal floors, but Warp Scarf can still be situationally useful, such as for example by allowing us to warp away from a dead end, instead of backtracking or using a more immediate warp seed which we might not have. The next dungeon is Dark Hill, and this one's a doozy. It's 15 floors long, and we will encounter plenty of ghost types here, which have the special ability of being able to go through walls. They're particularly obnoxious in hallways, where they'll be able to attack us from the walls on the sides without us being able to strike back, since our moves cannot hit them while in that state. If we get here a little under level, some enemies may even be able to live some of our attacks, so that can be a bit of a pain. One strategy we can employ here to get more one-turn kills is to run around at low health. What this does is it allows Flail, part of Eevee's link set, to deal more damage, since it's a move that starts dealing 1.5 times more damage if we're below half health, and 2 times more damage if we're below a quarter health. Just being below half health is enough to get guaranteed kills on every enemy in this dungeon. Having a lot of Reviver Seeds on hand here is definitely very helpful in ensuring relative safety for running around with low health, since it obviously makes us more vulnerable from enemy attacks. A bit of a low-key dangerous enemy here is actually Dusclops. The reason why is because it has the pressure ability, which will make moves consume double the PPs when used against it. And this is particularly problematic for our partner Totodile, which by now is just fighting enemies off screen for the most part, and for his linked moves. There's a mechanic I haven't mentioned yet about linked moves, and that is that if any moves in the link set has their PPs drop to 0, then the entire link set will break, and the moves will go back to only being usable individually. Our partner is usually smart enough to not use his link set if any of the moves that make it up only has 1 PP left, but it isn't smart enough to do that against an enemy with pressure with 2 PPs left. So, if he has to fight a Dusclops, then he could risk having his moves delinked, which would be extremely bad at this point in time, since we won't be able to go back in town to relink them for a long time. And as such, we need to be really careful and use a max elixir on him preemptively, before he could possibly run out of PPs. The risk of Totodile's moves delinking is that he's no longer going to be able to defend against enemies on his own anymore, so we will have to get him off of the waiter tactic and carry him around, slowing down our movement throughout the floor. Notable in this dungeon are also floors 6 and 11, which are the so-called Beetle layout. These will contain one single huge room in the center and 6 rooms on the sides. If we spawn in one of the side rooms, we want to check the big room right away, as its size makes it more likely for the stairs to be there. If that's not where they are, then we need to check all the other rooms one by one. Once out of Dark Hill, we will go through a 2-part dungeon called Sealed Ruin. There's not much to talk about here, aside from the boss, Spiritomb. We can't just wail on it, but if we have some items available, we can do an off-screen strat where we get in front of Spiritomb, throw a stun seed to petrify it, then dash down and throw a sleep seed to allow Totodile to complete the fight on his own. After this boss, Grovyle will temporarily join our team and we will go through Dusk Forest. Like we do from earlier, we won't be able to control his AI, but this time around at least Grovyle is pretty strong and only has attacking moves, so he's going to need much less babysitting. Layouts in this place can get pretty big, so they can be tricky to navigate. However, we might want to save any pure seeds we might have for the next dungeon, because this place is atrocious. This is Deep Dusk Forest. Celebi will temporarily join our team as well, and while she's not that weak either, and also shiny, this is making our team pretty crowded. Layouts in this place tend to be pretty bad. Connectivity is pretty low, making us frequently encounter dead ends and forcing us to go back on our way. Some enemies also have pretty annoying moves, such as Rhydon having Rock Blast, another dangerous multi-hit move, and Steelix having Rock Polish to boost their speed and make sure we can't run away from them, and Sandstorm. Speaking of Sandstorm, this weather condition is pretty common here, and having as big of a team as we have right now is problematic. Sandstorm continuously deals damage every 10 turns, and every time it does so, it will cause text to appear in the message log pointing out that we just took damage, and we will be stopped in place and unable to move until this text has finished scrolling. And since we have a big team now, we will be forced to read this message for every one of our team members, making navigation really slow. We would be able to skip this message if they were to be off screen, but unfortunately we can't control Groval and Celebi's AI, so we can't put them on the wait their tactic like we can with Totodile. While there are ways to leave them behind somewhat, this is a very dangerous thing to do since they'll often prioritize reuniting with us over defending themselves, and as such they're likely to die a few times around enemies without our help, and if any of them die without having any reviver seeds in our inventory, we will immediately lose the dungeon. So we really want to skip floors with pure seeds here if we can. However, not having an infinite supply of them, we want to be selective with where we use them. When we spawn, we can look at a variety of factors that could indicate to us that the floors we would be about to play could be particularly slow. If we spawn in a small room, that could mean we just spawned in a big floor, which is going to take particularly long to go through thanks to this dungeon's poor connectivity between rooms. If we spawn immediately into sandstorm weather, that's going to make traversal slow. If we spawn and there's immediately one or few enemies in the room, that's going to force us to immediately watch a few attack animations if we were to play that floor. These are all aggravating factors that should make us consider using a pure seed more strongly, depending also on how many we have left, and taking into consideration that we might just see a worse floor later in the dungeon or even in a future dungeon. If we ever see a floor containing all three of our aggravating factors we just talked about though, yeah, just forget the floor and skip it. Once we're out of this cursed place, we will leave Celebi behind and go back to the present. We won't be quite back in town yet, however, and our last obstacle will now be Tree Shrub Forest, which is the longest individual dungeon in the run, made up of 20 floors. This place is actually not too bad, but we really have to watch out about our PPs, especially because starting from the 10th floor, Vespiquen will begin to spawn, who has the pressure ability, which we had to deal with back in Dark Hill with Dusclops and presented the risk of our Totodile's moves delinking. The solution here is the same. As long as we preemptively use a max elixir, we will be okay. However, if Totodile's moves actually do delink here, it's actually fine, because we will finally have access to town again after this dungeon. We will want to delay our visit to Lactovire's link shop until after the next dungeon though, which is Waterful Cave. Again. Yep, this is the dungeon we played much earlier in the game, back when our team was over 20 levels lower. Nope, there is absolutely nothing different about this place this time around. Though the layouts we will encounter are still random of course, it's still the same dungeon and enemies are the same as they were back then, making them a complete pushover now. This is also we can speak with the Sage Torkoal at the hot spring at the end of the dungeon, which does have a quick travel option, but which only unlocks in the post-game, for some reason. Well, regardless, the end of the run is approaching. We get one last opportunity to visit town, and if we need to relink our moves, we can. We can also add an extra move to both Totodile's and Eevee's link sets if we want, but that's just a safety option to guarantee one turn KOs on some enemies coming up, and if all we care about is raw speed, we don't really want to do that. The next dungeon is going to be Brunk Cave, and this basically marks the beginning of the endgame. You know what else is really interesting about this game? We've discussed earlier how it's really hard, if not impossible, to make optimal plays, and we can pretty much always improve as a runner. But another important part of this discussion is that it's really hard to even tell which ones the optimal plays are. Take this situation for example. We started exploring this floor, and eventually found a dead end. If we wanted to explore some different rooms to look for the stairs, we would have to backtrack. But wait! We have a warp seed in our inventory, which when eaten would teleport us to a random spot in the floor. If we eat it, it would essentially re-randomize our location, and potentially either get us closer to the stairs, or if not, at least it could get us to a spot where we would be able to avoid any unnecessary backtracking. So, do we eat it? Or do we save it? Either for a potentially worse situation that we could encounter later, or to throw it towards an enemy we might not want to fight. There does technically exist a statistically correct answer here, but calculating it is very difficult if not practically impossible due to simply how many factors there are at play. What we do here is we throw maths and statistics out the window and we make a judgment call based on our gut feeling and expertise with the game. Even the Pokémon team we choose is questionable. We've been talking about Eevee and Totodile this entire time, but remember how at the very beginning of the video I simply called this team the one that, and I quote, is believed to likely be fastest. That's right, is believed. We have no hard proof of this. Take for example a team consisting of Bulbasaur and Meowth, which has set a few world records in this game's history. Let's start from the partner. Meowth hits a little harder than Totodile and struggles a little less against some specific opponents, and we would choose him along with Eevee if we could, but unfortunately this game prevents us from choosing two Pokemon that share the same type, and since Eevee and Meowth are both normal types, we can't. But our partner isn't too important since, as you saw, for most of this run, they're just killing enemies off screen. What about Bulbasaur? Well, she presents a few drawbacks compared to Eevee, hitting a little less hard, having longer attack animations, and missing attacks a little more often. On the plus side, for a decent portion of this run, she can leverage some tap effectiveness by keeping Razor Leaf as a standalone attack alongside her standard Link set, which allows getting one-hit KOs on a ton of enemies while also getting a really quick attack animation along with it. She's also much bulkier than Eevee, allowing us to play much more recklessly while relying much less on taking the time to eat Oran Berries and finding Reviver Seeds. Do these things balance each other out? Maybe? How would we know? We would have to calculate the likelihoods to encounter each enemy types in each dungeon, determine how much time we would spend on each enemy on average with each of Eevee and Bulbasaur, factor in the amount of time that Eevee's fragility costs us and weigh with the likelihood of finding enough Reviver Seeds to play more recklessly, and finally also factor in the time we're losing from using Totodile instead of Meowth. This just gets too complicated and is frankly close to unknowable. What we as speedrunners have a much easier time doing is to simply do a bunch of runs, make a note of the times we end up getting at the end of every one of them, and then get a feel for whether we tend to get better times with one team or another, along with some considerations for where maybe our play or our routing could improve in certain aspects. Eevee has been getting slightly better times overall, but the difference is not huge. And honestly, I think this is a really cool part about the game. It makes it feel a lot more open-ended and full of discoveries to be made. It feels like it's one more way in which it's unlikely this game will become mostly an RNG grind anytime soon. Along with our skills having a lot of room for improvement, there's a lot of knowledge yet to be made that can help our times. And I think that's a very good trait for a speedrun to have. In Brine Cave, we have yet another Pokemon as part of our team that we won't be able to control. This time around, that being Shadow. He's pretty strong, so despite slowing down our movement a little bit, this isn't a huge deal. Layouts are pretty standard, and a lot of enemies will die fairly easily, so this isn't a particularly threatening place. However, this dungeon has a second part, where Shadow will be gone, layouts will get bigger, and enemies will get stronger. We will need to be a tiny bit more careful in the second part. The boss of this dungeon is Kabutops and 2 Omastar. We can manipulate their movements by tapping A and B to wait one turn and let Totodile face one of the Omastar one-on-one. We can then kill the other Omastar ourselves, and once they're both gone, focus on the tankier Kabutops to finish the fight. The next dungeon is Hidden Land. This is another 2-part dungeon, and Grovyle will rejoin us here. This place is pretty difficult. A lot of enemies hit very hard and can even straight up one-shot us if they crit us, so we need to be pretty careful in their presence. Bastiodon are also pretty threatening here, since they're so tanky that they will likely survive our attacks, allowing it an opportunity to potentially retaliate with Swagger, applying confusion. We didn't really talk about the status until this point, but it's a really powerful condition in this game, as it makes it so that using a move while in the status randomizes the direction in which we will actually attack, effectively giving us a 1 in 8 chance to actually hit the enemy we want while confused. If we try to move, the direction in which we will move becomes randomized as well, making it a very difficult state to be in. If we have a heal seed on hand, we want to immediately eat it to heal confusion, or alternatively, we can do something like throwing a warp seed to teleport the Bastiodon away and then wait a few turns for confusion to subside. On top of that all, floors can be difficult to traverse here too. Connectivity isn't great. Floors starting from the 9th will start potentially being very large, and what's more is that occasionally an Abomasnow will spawn, setting the weather to hail and dealing gradual damage as we move around, which is similar to what we had to deal with in Deep Dust Forest, with the constant text doubly slowing down our movement thanks to Grovyle being on screen. It can be a very good idea to use pure seeds here if we spawn in a floor that looks pretty bad. The second part of this dungeon is very similar to the later floors of the first part, so everything still applies to it and there's not much more to add. Once we're out of Hidden Land, we're going to fight the second to last boss in the run, Dusknoir and his minion Sableye. If we were to try and make our way through this fight normally, we would immediately be surrounded on the second turn and be subject to Dusknoir's wider range of annoying moves, such as Confuse Ray, applying confusion, and Pursuit, which is basically a sort of counter that dishes back any damage that we deal while he has it up. So instead, we hopefully have a stun seed here and immediately throw it at Dusknoir to get him out of the fight for a bit. From there, we attack all the Sableye which have now surrounded us, focusing first on the ones near Grovyle, who, unlike us, will not be able to one-shot them if he chooses to use Quick Attack. Once every Sableye is gone, we then place Totodile next to Dusknoir, go off-screen, then throw a Sleep Seed to let Totodile defeat him fully off-screen. Finally, after this boss fight, we have our final challenge, Temporal Tower. Grovyle is no longer with us, and not too far from that meaning of the sentence. So it's just Eevee and Totodile tackling the 13 and 10 floors that make up this last 2-part dungeon. This place is pretty tough. Despite this, Hidden Land honestly presented a bigger challenge, with its poor connectivity and occasional hail, so if we've made it this far, we can beat this place too. An infamous enemy that can be encountered here is Porygon, who has the move Discharge and can hit anyone in the room upon using it. However, if you have played this game and have bad memories from this move, you may not realize that the enemy AI is actually only able to use it if any members of your team are within at least 2 tiles from it. So the nightmare scenarios of a Porygon walking into a room and hitting the entire team with discharge before we even have a chance to approach just aren't possible. Regardless, Reviver Seeds and Oran Berries to heal are very helpful for safety, as enemies do hit pretty hard here. This being the last dungeon, we also want to make use of all the useful items we have left available. Any crowd control orbs we kept to handle monster houses can now be used to neutralize any regular enemies to save the time that fighting them would take. Although we probably still want to keep one of those orbs for the very last floor, just in case, because monster houses can very much still appear and losing a run to a monster house on the very last floor of the run would feel really bad. Anyway, after clearing this dungeon, we have our final boss, Cramel Dialga. This fight is really dangerous. Dialga has a ton of health and has Roar of Time, which is a move that deals damage to our entire team and can potentially one-shot us if hitting as a critical hit. On top of that, inflicting status on it won't be very effective either, as it has the Self-Curer trait, which will make any status condition last half as long, meaning that throwing a sleep seed could make that sleep status only last as little as 2 turns. For a long time of this game's speedrunning history, this fight was very problematic. But fear not, a strat was eventually found that, while not completely foolproof, is able to make deaths from this boss much less likely. And it all revolves around an item that we picked up much earlier in the run and is sitting in our inventory. That item, of course, is Geopetals. You might find it surprising if you know what this item does. It's a throwable item that deals a measly 10 HP of damage when used against an enemy. So why would they be useful against Dialga, who has a whopping 700 HP of health? Well, we start the fight by moving left and throwing a stun seed. Dialga has a chance to use Roar of Time before we can petrify it, so hopefully it either doesn't use it, or if it does, we can survive it. Once it's immobilized, we execute our plan. We move up left, and then place the Geopetals down in front of Totodile. Then, we dash down and throw any item at Dialga to unpetrify it. It can once again use Roar of Time here potentially, but eventually it should approach Totodile to attempt to attack him. This is going to make Dialga pick up the Geopetals. And this is going to make the enemy AI very likely to throw the Geopetals instead of using its attacks, which is going to deal very little damage. So with that, Dialga is mostly neutralized and Totodile can make quick work of it off screen. The strat hadn't been known for about a decade of this game's speedrunning history and was eventually found by Shady Gamer X. Funnily enough, however, this really should have been found much sooner because it has been in the official strategy guide for this game all along. No speedrunner had really checked this guide thoroughly until after this strat was found, so it had evaded everyone for a really long time. So, hey, the strategy guide is actually really good after all. Or, I mean, we can also just do an RNG manip and fight Dialga on screen. It's slightly slower, but we can guarantee a fight that only takes 1 Reviver Seed or even 0. It's a slightly less exciting way to end the run, but it works very well. Once Primal Dialga goes down, the final few cutscenes will begin playing. Crying in that one cutscene is mandatory. After the last cutscene finishes playing, we can stop our timer, and the credits will begin rolling. With the entire run behind us, it might be pretty clear why this game is actually pretty interesting and enjoyable as a speedrun. It is true that there is a lot of randomness, but that very randomness is what helps make the run incredibly complex and dynamic. And coupled with the absurdly high amount of skill and knowledge that the game demands, it creates an incredible amount of depth, where our ability to adapt to each situation at hand and master what is in our control gets abundantly rewarded. This at first might have looked like an unspeedrunnable game due to how the entire gameplay changes literally every time we play, but it actually turns out to be a run that leaves a lot of room for expression of skill, where we can plan around this randomness and have a lot of control over the times we ultimately end up getting. I think that Pokémon Mystery Dungeon, Explorers of Sky, is an incredibly unique run, and it's not only one of my favorite games of all time, but it's also one of my favorite games I've ever speedrun. If you want to run this game yourself, please feel encouraged to. The resources available to learn the ropes will probably change depending on when you're watching this, but as of the making of this video, there is a Discord server that you're very welcome to join entirely dedicated to Pokémon Mystery Dungeon speedrunning, and we also have a wiki which includes a bunch of guides and explanations. For how deep this run can get, it's not actually too difficult to learn the basics and get started. It's a relatively common practice for runners to even literally jump straight into their first run and only read a guide on what they're supposed to do along the way, which is especially easier on the vanilla game with its numerous long cutscenes in between most bits of gameplay. But feel free to do the same on the speedrun mod and simply pause whenever you need to read something. Once again, both the original game and the speedrun mod have their own leaderboards, so feel free to choose whichever one you're most comfortable with. If you don't have a physical Nintendo DS to play on, you can also play on emulator, and the speedrun mod is even designed to allow for cross-platform competition through its built-in timer, which removes loading times and lag and makes it a fairer comparison metric regardless of what you play on. We're a pretty small community, but we're always happy to see new runners pick this game or other Pokémon Mystery Dungeon titles up. And with that, I think it's finally time to end this video. Thank you very much for watching. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this, and take care!